Welcome to today's research rundown. Before we begin, I just have one quick announcement, and that is to invite you to our Food for Thought, which will be on Thursday, March 19th, as Torta Simonson will present You May Plow Here, the narrative of Sarah Brooks. So I hope to see you all here at the archives, and that'll be in our Farley Auditorium, but it'll also be streaming live here to our Facebook and YouTube channels. So without further ado, let's get to today's program. I am happy to welcome onto the stage Kayla Scott Gurner, and she's going to present to you tips for transcription. Welcome, Kayla.
Thank you, Alex. Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to cover some basics of reading handwritten documents and transcribing them for easier use in research. As we work on genealogical and historical research, we often find documents that are, at first glance, illegible. Transcribing these documents allows us to decipher the words and meanings so they can be useful. Transcription can be an important research tool, so let's look at some tips and methods for doing it on your own. Why should you consider digitizing and transcribing a document? Using copies protects the original document by minimizing the amount the document is handled. Illegible writing and faded words make a document hard to read and comprehend. Making a digital scan and/or a copy of the document can allow you to darken it and enlarge the writing for easier reading. Reading an original document can be time-consuming. If you don't transcribe the document, you will have to translate it every time you read it. Taking time to give a detailed look at your document minimizes the damage from extra handling and can uncover previously undetected words and meanings. A few tips for handling and using the document for transcription include that you should never write on original records. What's done cannot be undone and will cause irreversible damage. Scan original records if possible using the highest resolution available to you. Scanning lessens document handling and provides you with the ability to zoom in on hard to read words and lighten or darken the contrast for easier viewing. This will also allow you to print out a copy of the document you can then write on if you choose. With faded words, you may be able to make a copy of the document and trace over the words to finally read them. Some copiers will also allow you to darken the copy to make the writing more vivid. Our copier at ADAH, for instance, has a light original setting that will specifically work to darken the writing. If trying to get a darker copy like this, I recommend only copying the document once and using a copy to attempt the darkening process. For scans and copies, 600 dpi or higher, such as 1200, is best for giving the most detailed image. If copying instead of scanning, make at least 3 or more copies of the document. There are different transcription methods that you may find helpful: typing as you read, making notes in between the lines on the copy, or writing the transcription as you read it on a separate piece of paper. A few things you will need include an understanding of how to read and write cursive, a magnifying glass or ability to zoom in on a digital copy, good light source, computer, a digital scanner and/or copier if possible, and a pencil and paper, and of course, patience. There will inevitably be mistakes in almost any document that you transcribe. You should be consistent with how you note misspelled words or incorrect punctuation. While we may be inclined to correct everything as we go, I prefer to include the errors myself. After all, the errors are part of the history of the document. If you do make corrections as you go instead of leaving the errors in, you should note that at the beginning or end of the document you're transcribing. Misspelled words from the original document should be noted with the notation of spelled incorrectly or SIC in brackets. If you're transcribing something with length, such as a diary, make notes of misspelled words as you find them. This will help later if you find words that are smudged or illegible. Also, if you're transcribing documents as a volunteer, check with the organization you're assisting to be sure that you are following their specific guidelines. Here are a few tips to consider while reading a document that you wish to transcribe. If working with more than a page or two of text, begin by reading a few pages to become familiar with the handwriting. On unclear words, pay attention to how letters are formed in more legible pages. Make note of any words that are consistently misspelled or letters that are consistently misformed. Consider context clues. For example, a diary entry about a church is more likely to be talking about a sermon, not salmon. A letter describing a fleet moving downriver is probably talking about a large raft, not a giraffe. Consider the topics mentioned in a letter or document. Context can suggest there was a meeting, not a mutiny. Be prepared to do some light research on place names and locations. Pay attention to loops and tails of letters that spread into other words. For example, the tail of Y or G may obscure a part of a word or appear to be an additional letter on the line below. Consider improper closure of letters and how they may resemble other letters, for example, A and U. Keep in mind that phonetic spelling and localized speech influences may impact the clarity of writing. For a refresher, here is an example of what correctly formed cursive letters should look like, at least in theory. Everyone has their own writing style. Some will have more polished writing skills than others, and circumstances such as wartime and battle conditions will impact how clear writing may be. On the left, we have an example of how some writers may combine both print and cursive letters in the words that they write. Some letters can look like other letters, especially if they are written in haste. A few examples here show some of those most commonly confused. A can look like O or U. An unclosed O can look like a C or U. E can look like I with no dot. I can look like J, and J can look like I if there's a smaller obscured tail. Poorly formed J's and G's can be mistaken for each other. G and Q are extremely similar even when written correctly. A, capitalized Q, looks similar to the number 2, and Z can look like a Q with a tail. Unnecessary flourishes do not help these similarities. We also must contend with what the passage of time has done to the document we are looking at. Was it written in iron gall ink that has eaten away portions of the page? Or perhaps it was written in pencil like the letter we see here. The pencil markings have smeared some over time, making the letter blurry, faded, and more difficult to read. Magnifying the document helps us bring the writing into focus and see that this letter discusses Fort Morgan and its location on Mobile Point, along with providing us with this neat sketch of the area. One of the worst offending documents for poor penmanship are census records. This record is more legible than many, yet it's still rushed in appearance. A common way of writing words with double S's at this time was to make a tail with the first S before forming the second. As you can see in this example, this practice made this S look like a P. Here's an example from the late 1700s of how an S can sometimes appear to be an F if handwritten documents as well as in print. It appears to be most commonly used when two S's appear in a word, but it can also be found occasionally as a standalone letter. Let's look at another census record. If you didn't know better, you would once again think this says Tennessee instead of Tennessee. Double S's were often formed in a way that looked like the above, leaving an unnecessary tail hanging down below and looking very similar to a P. Let's also look at the post office listed. The first letter could easily be an ill-formed M, and the last flourish could almost be an S. You'll notice how it comes up to a little bit of a point. Luckily, I'm familiar with the area this refers to, so I know that this is referring to Wayland Springs, a small community near the Alabama state line. Court cases that have handwritten transcripts can also be difficult to understand. Sometimes poor penmanship was an issue, and other times the apparent urge to add as many loops and embellishments as possible made the words almost unreadable. An additional problem for a lot of Alabama Supreme Court cases includes stamped dates, seals, and other words or numbers written over the main text. You would think that the court reporter would have known how to write and spell the counties in his division, but here we have what honestly looks like MRRENGS, Rings County. The two R's appear very defined, and what must have been intended for an O at the end has a point on the top instead of being rounded. If you know the names of Alabama counties and or you do a little bit of research to see what Alabama counties are in the second division of Alabama's Supreme Court, you will note the only possible county this could be referring to is Marengo, spelled Marengo. And once you have that name in mind, you can kind of see Marengo when you look at it. This case illustrates the problem of not just a misspelling, but what could have also been an overzealous crossing of the single T in Burkhalter. Since the T and the L are both the same height and both letters across, it appears that this name is Burkhatter. A little research in the newspapers reveals that the correct spelling was indeed Burkhalter. Also, a great illustration of unnecessary flourishes can be seen with several letters on this page, including the A in A.E. Bell's name. Yet another example of the importance of knowing place names in the area you're researching is shown here in the Civil War Widow's Pension application. This is not how to write Mobile, but it's close enough that we can tell this is referring to Mobile County. Note the B is not fully formed in the top example. That and the lack of a dot over what might could be construed as an I make it seem like there is no I there at all. On both the top and bottom examples, the E at the end of the word is poorly formed and is almost non-existent on the bottom one. And then there are death certificates. Medical doctors are notorious for having poor handwriting in the best of situations, and death certificates really show this talent off. When you add in the formal names of diseases and the fact that some diseases are modernly known by other names than what may be listed, it definitely complicates matters. Some diseases and terms may be more or less extinct today, so they may be unfamiliar to us entirely. Here we have what was, on this 1946 death certificate, a cause of death and contributing factor. At first glance, the cause of death looks like cerebral apopleg or apopleg, especially when you note the stray dot hovering over the end of the word that could be the dot of an I. This didn't sound like a familiar term at all, so I turned to Google. Google did not recognize the term apopling, but it did provide an alternative suggestion of apoplexy. Cerebral apoplexy was what we might call a stroke today. Next, we see the cause of death was due to what looks like CHR nephrite. CHR is an abbreviation for chronic, but what is nephrite or nephrites? Using Google once again, I can find that chronic nephritis refers to an inflammatory disease that harms the blood vessels and kidneys and may also be referred to or involve chronic kidney disease. Taking time to really look at these words, make out as many letters as possible, and then input that information into Google turns what was gibberish into understandable terms. Even newspaper articles can be easier to use in your research after transcribing them. Issues such as poor quality typesetting, decay, and ink smears can make magnification and transcription of the document a useful tool. So we've talked about deciphering words and letters in documents such as death certificates and census records. Now let's take a look at fully handwritten works such as letters and journals. Here we have a journal page from a young girl who consistently had issues with ink blots, misspelled certain words, and poorly formed others. She was still learning to write and rarely used punctuation. After transcribing several pages of this diary, her writing became increasingly clearer to me, and various patterns emerged. She had daily habits and activities that she wrote about often, one of which was knitting. This knowledge, more than anything, helps me reasonably guess that the first smudged example over on the top left here says, I knitted. Another habit she had was to spell the word until with two L's every single time. In this last excerpt, she was writing that someone had been shot in the ankle at the Battle of Manassas, but not dangerously. According to her journal and other records, she had a brother, Watkins, whom they often referred to as Watt, and I believe that is who she is discussing in this entry. Instead of writing that Watt got shot, she said Watt got shoot, which is another example of how a misspelled word could cause some confusion, especially if surrounding words are illegible. This next example uses a short journal of 12 pages that details the Civil War siege of Fort Morgan, as noted at the top of the page. The author, Private Joseph Wilkinson, was writing this document under battle conditions, and the account unfortunately ends before the siege did. You can tell this document was once folded, leading to the pages having bits missing from around the fold lines. The edges are also frayed, breaking off and taking some of the script with them. There are different transcription methods that you may find helpful. These include typing as you read, making notes in between the lines on the copy, or writing the transcription as you read it on a separate piece of paper. My preferred method when something is really difficult to piece together is to make a clear, high-quality copy and transcribe it between the lines like you see here. Mr. Wilkinson was writing this under battle conditions inside Fort Morgan on Mobile Bay, and unfortunately his writing ends before the siege did, as I mentioned. His handwriting is great considering the circumstances, but not so great for trying to read. He misspells several words, including the names of ships involved in the battle. On the first line, we can see that he misspelled the word siege. He used EI when it is IE. We can also see that he abbreviated the word fort instead of really crossing the T. He just moved into writing the M in Morgan. Mr. Wilkinson was also not a great believer in consistent capitalization or punctuation, most often using dashes to separate his thoughts if he used anything at all. There are several words in this document that context tells us what the word is more so than the existence of all the letters the word should possess. For me, writing my translation of the document as I slowly decipher each word helps me to stay focused on letter formation without shifting my eyes from the document to a separate page. After I had finished transcribing the diary on a copy of each page, I went back and typed it up into a Microsoft Word document like you see here. I noted words that were obviously misspelled with SIC in brackets, and for my personal use, I placed question marks in parentheses for words I can't be 100% certain I have correct. For the most part, I left original punctuation and spelling as they were in the original document, which I noted on the last page of my transcription. I prefer, as most historians do, to leave the original spellings and punctuations in not only the transcription, but any quotations I might use in projects that I write. Those original idiosyncrasies can say a lot about the writer, and if we aren't careful, cleaning it up can change some of the original meanings the writer had intended to convey. Be aware that spell check will fight you on leaving in these misspelled words and may autocorrect them just as it autocorrected the word siege in the title for my document. As you can see, a typewritten copy is so much easier to read than the original document, which makes it easier to use and refer to repeatedly in my research. One other thing I noted in my transcript was when holes in the original diary prevented me from being able to read a word or series of words. Once again, if you are working as a volunteer for an organization's transcription project, be sure to follow any guidelines they have for marking things like this. For your own research purposes, the important thing is to be able to go back a few years later and know exactly how you transcribed it. It's also helpful for future reference to add the date you transcribed the document, which you can see I did in the top right-hand corner in the header. While it is easiest sometimes to get a grasp on someone's handwriting when you have a longer document such as a journal, we often don't have that luxury. Here we have a letter written in 1866 to Governor Robert M. Patton by a gentleman named S.K. Rayburn. Mr. Rayburn was writing to the governor to find out why his pardon for serving in the Civil War had fallen into the hands of a gentleman who was now demanding money before he would turn the document over to him. Let's look at a few of the interesting issues we can note when trying to read or transcribe this document, which I have placed as excerpts here on the right of the slide. First of all, Mr. Rayburn misspelled or misformed the letters in the word governor. It appears he left out the R, which can be a common way of pronouncing the title. Now look at how he wrote the word address. There could possibly be a letter missing in the scribbled word, but we can definitely see an example of the double S being written with something akin to a P with that pesky tail. Let's read this next excerpt. You and your goodness will pardon the presumption of as humble an individual as myself for imposing upon your time and attention. In the first line, what should be the O in pardon looks more like an E. Noting this might help us figure out a word later in the letter if it is less clear than this one. In the second line at the end, we see the writer would begin a word at the end of a line and finish it at the beginning of the next. While this saves paper, it can be confusing, particularly if the writer doesn't include dashes to denote the word is being broken up and should continue on the following line. And lastly, let's look at what must be the word recommend at the end of this last example. In this sentence, the writer is discussing how the governor had recommended his case to the president for pardon. If we didn't have context, it could be easy to look at this word and see gibberish, as the writer failed to form essential loops in letters, close other letters, and may have even left a letter or two out. It's really difficult to tell. So, who was this man that Mr. Rayburn accused of holding his pardon hostage? Mr. Rayburn identified him as Major Sear, or Major Sears, as best as you can make out in his writing. For someone who has researched this era, read a lot of newspapers, governor's papers, or correspondence from the time, you might be able to make the connection that this is discussing known pardon broker C.L. Sayer. Mr. Rayburn badly misspelled his name, but it is quite possible that he had never seen the name in writing and was spelling it the best he could based on how it had been spoken to him. Readers of this letter don't have to be left in suspense, however, as someone in the governor's office wrote a summary of the letter on the back of the document that read, wants to know if Major C.L. Sayer has the authority to charge $25 for procuring his pardon. Sayer appears in several letters in the governor's collections, as my friend Amelia, who's currently digitizing that collection, can attest to. So the governor's office was very aware of him. So let's say you simply had the name Major Sayer spelled out correctly, or at least a little more closely to it. You might also just have the name C.L. Sayer and be trying to figure out what C.L. stands for. Either case can be helped by looking at other documents that fit his lifetime. For Major Sayer, we can check for military records showing possible Confederate service on fold 3. The only match I found for this rank was a man who ended his service with the rank of major, and his name is Calvin L. Sayer. This fits newspaper articles that discuss a CL or Calvin Sayer who was drawing attention for being a pardon broker. The article here refers Sayer as a claim agent in Washington. Other articles discuss his involvement in pension claims and pardons as well. The census record here from 1870 shows a Calvin L. Sayer who was born in Alabama but at this point was living in Washington, which fits with the narrative we have pieced together. So, what should you do if you can't figure out the name of a person or place despite having looked at the writing style and writer's letter formation? Look at other records that the subject could be mentioned in. For place names, you can look at maps, which you can find in state, county, and university archives surrounding the area you're researching. You can Google the name of the place or try Google Maps and zoom in and see if you can find names of communities. City directories are helpful, many of which are available on Ancestry.com. Newspapers are a wonderful resource, and they will talk about news stories and items of interest in various towns and communities. Census records, and of course, the Encyclopedia of Alabama is a great resource for place names. It is an online resource that provides articles on all Alabama counties. Some smaller towns or communities can be mentioned, along with name changes and changes to county lines. For researching the names of people, you can also try looking at census records, marriage records, newspapers, and military records, which are particularly useful for research for the years surrounding war times. This concludes today's presentation. We have time for a few questions before we go, so please drop those in the comments section. For later questions, you can always email me at kayla.scott@archives.alabama.gov.
Excellent. Thank you, Kayla.
Thank
And
you.
like Kayla said, if you have a question, you can put it in the comments. We'll be able to see it, and we can ask Kayla the question right now. Or you can also email her if you have a specific question about something that you're transcribing or any other kind of research questions. But while we're waiting to see if y'all have any questions, I had a couple. So the first one is, you gave us a lot of really great tips for transcription, things like that. If you had to choose kind of like what's like the most important or what's like the best tip that you could give or the thing to really start off with, what would that be?
Really reading the document multiple times,
Hmm.
reading it, setting it aside, reading it again. Um, it's amazing, and I'm not the only one who's had this thought. Many colleagues and other people, even when I was in college, like we would discuss how it was amazing that you could read something 7 times, and then that 8th time, it's like, "Oh my gosh, that's what that word is." So, sometimes it's like it's hieroglyphics, and all of a sudden it gets turned into something that you can actually read just
Yeah.
because your brain has kind of reset to looking at the way this person writes letters, forms
Hmm.
words, and then it just kind of comes together because you've familiarized yourself with that particular style of writing.
Yeah. Like seeing how they form the words. And so that's like maybe when you first read it, you thought it was something completely different, but then all of a sudden you realize, oh, I've seen that letter before. That's what, and then just something to unlock it,
Right.
you know. So what do you do if, and we have a question here specifically about um, French, but how would you approach if you're trying to do something that's not in your first language? What would be, do you have any specific tips for that?
That is not something that I've really delved into
Hmm.
myself. I know my husband works with some French documents
Hmm.
sometimes, and it, of course, French is not his first language either, but
Hmm.
I know he has, some um, like dictionary
Hmm.
English to French, French to English dictionaries, and then looking also, a lot of it is also the same principles of looking at letter formation,
Hmm.
looking at how they refer to, because one of the things that he has spoken to me about is like ranks. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you don't understand the differences in military ranks
Mm-hmm.
in another language in another country, then these strange phrasings can be very confusing. So just learning about, particularly if you're doing research into another country like that,
Yeah,
making sure you know as much as possible about the subject, about the place, about the time period is going to be very helpful.
I would agree. I did some research that forced me to do some transcription of 19th century Spanish records. And so when I was doing it exactly like you said, it's just it's very it's very similar in the fact that like the first thing I did is I would try to write out what I thought the letters were, and then that way it takes an extra step. So if it's not your first language, there are a couple of other steps you have to do. Kind of like Kayla was saying, you have to know the time period, um, know that particular country, some specifics there. But it was also, all right, this is what I think the word says. Is there an equivalent word like that I may not know? Like so, like then looking to see is there something there? Does that make sense? So it was a little bit extra, like okay, this is what I think it is right now, but now let me finish the sentence and the words I do know, and it's kind of like also filling in the gaps there. There's also like depending on what you're using it for, um, how exact it needs to be. Like, are you needing to get something very exact because you need this to be there, or can you kind of figure out like I know these words, and what are some context clues to get the idea of what it is? So there's kind of like a what are you using it for, and why do you need X, Y, Z? But um, it's a lot of the same tips that Kayla gave you, but the added layer of having to figure out maybe what that word is in that language. We have a couple of other questions kind of coming in, I think, so I want to make sure I ask them. Someone asked about a copy of the slides. This presentation is currently being recorded. It'll be on our Facebook and our YouTube channels, so you can go back to it. And if you have other specific questions, you can kind of go and email Kayla. If there was something specifically in there that you want to see, you can always email Kayla. And then is there a charge to come make copies that will help see the document better? So if someone is trying to get something from our collection, Kayla, how would you suggest they go about getting a copy of something from our collection that they need to get transcription for?
So, a lot of really good resources that I mentioned in today's presentation are already digitized in our digital collections.
Mm-hmm.
So, if that is the case, then just go to digital collections, search for the subject that you're looking for, and you'll be able to download a copy, and then you can zoom in as much or as little as you need. You can make copies and write in between the lines like I did. Other than that, if you were wanting to come in and actually make a copy of something that has not been digitized already and isn't restricted, um, then it's 25 cents a copy for us to make copies for you. And we can also make scans. If you're needing something that's super high resolution, then that's a question for Meredith's team, because they are the ones that digital collections are the ones that put those really great images and documents with that really high resolution on our website.
And one more question. This is one from me too, because it's something that I've always kind of had a question about too, and I've been doing transcriptions. Is there like if you come across a word that is not really in use anymore, where do you go to try to figure out, what it means? Do you just go to the dictionary, or is there like a special kind of like 19th century dictionary that you would go to or something like that? How would you handle if there's like a word that may not be in use anymore?
A lot of times, context gives you some idea.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I can't think of what the word was recently, but there was a word that I have not seen in any kind of modern writing, and I mean, it mainly meant a ruckus, a
Mm-hmm.
fracas. It was like that's what they were trying to get to, but they were trying to say that there'd been an argument, but they hadn't used that phrasing, and so kind of having the context helped me to just I use Google.
Yeah.
because Google is going to search a lot of different databases and different things, and they're going to be able to tell you, hey, this is the a word that was popular in 18th century, whatever, and be able to kind of help you out with that. And Google's really good too about catching um, words that you may be missing a letter or two of, maybe because the writer was missing a
Hmm.
letter or two of them. And so you can say, you can type the word in and it's going to say, oh, do you mean such and such? And it's like, yes, that makes so much more sense. Thank you.
You're like, yes, that is it. That is it.
But
No,
but
that I love that
definitely, a dictionary would be, in this day and age, would be my second go-to because,
because we have
um
Google now, and
right, and it's the easiest thing, and a dictionary is not going to help you fill in the missing letters like Google is.
yeah. So if you don't have it down right there, and that's a great point too, because like sometimes it might be that you have all of them. Like you said, it might be that the person then, because if there wasn't a standardized way of spelling it, or if they didn't know how to spell it, they didn't have spell check. So, it may be this moment that typing it in helps fill in all the gaps, including missing letters or things like that. And then you're like, that's exactly what they were saying. No, that's a great point too. So like we're in the 21st century, use 21st century technology too.
But I
No.
do love my hard copies. I love my books.
Well, thank you so much. And if you have other questions about transcriptions as you watch this later, feel free to put them in the comments, especially on Facebook. I think on YouTube, you can't do that later. But you can either email Kayla, or if you put them on here, we can try to go ahead and get them answered for you. So thank y'all so much. And thank you to Kayla. And for all of you here, make sure to join us next month on, I believe it is April 5th. For a discussion of how to research your, no, April 6th, sorry, not on the Sunday, but on the Monday, April 6th, for a discussion on how to research your Civil War ancestor. Thank you.
Thank you.